Well, I'm much more discouraged than I was when I walked into the meeting an hour ago. We had additional information that was requested last meeting about the use of appropriation bonds rather than GO bonds for the additional bonding projects that I've put forward. That would allow them to be funded and not count against the limit that the Republican caucuses have imposed on the bonding bill of less than $1 billion. We also found that a total of $320 million in trunk highway bonds could be issued with the existing capacity in MnDOT, which would, and I'll let Commissioner Zelli go through the numbers with you, but it means that over a couple $100 million in the cash that's now in the trunk highway bond, cash that's now in the bonding bill that was passed by the House and the Senate could be covered with trunk highway bonds, which would mean we'd have less use of cash in the bonding bill. We went through all those numbers in considerable detail, and people asked clarifying questions. And then just a few minutes ago, Speaker Daudt handed out two bills, one on preemption, one on school tax credits for private schools. Said that those were things that his caucus wanted to put on the table. Whether there are requirements for a special session or not, I don't know. It's the first I've heard of any of this. So I'm going to have lunch with my stepbrother, Andy McPhail, who's in town with the Philadelphia Phillies. I haven't seen him in 5 years. I'd stay if it were worth doing, but there's no point in staying. We're moving backwards. I asked the Speaker to call the next meeting and to set forth an agenda for the next meeting, because unless he's serious about trying to resolve the differences rather than add to the differences, we're not going to get anywhere. So I'm very pessimistic at this point. Glad to respond to questions.
Okay.
So give up on July special session? I mean, has that?
I don't know. I really don't. I mean, today it went backwards. They added two, measures that are enormously controversial. They know that. Preemption is what the large business community wants. Maybe the entire business community wants. But I've said before, if that were combined with something like family leave, it might be negotiable in a regular legislative session where there's time to have that good discussion. To think we're going to be able to resolve that in negotiations outside of a session and then come back and pass that, to me, is really, they know better. They know better than that. Same thing with the school tax credit for private education. Been debating that in here ever since I've been here. 39 years that's been debated. And it's controversial, and they have a perfect right to be in favor of it, but it's a condition trying to pass the tax bill and pass the bonding bill and get those resolved in a special session. These are just really make it extremely difficult to do so, and they must know that coming in. So, I began to think that the Republican caucuses don't want a special session. They'd rather just play politics with this. They'd rather just keep adding things to it. We give them information, they don't respond with a definitive response proposal. What will they accept, what will they not accept is in my proposal. And now they've added their own conditions to it. So I think we made a significant step backward today.
Governor, how long did you let these talks go on? You were hesitant to enter into them in the first place during session. You said there's no need for a special session.
I mean, we don't have an absolute deadline. But at some point you say, well, this is going anywhere. I mean, that's what I feel right now, but that's why I asked the Speaker to call the next meeting, schedule the next meeting, set the agenda for the next meeting, have him come back and say, this is what my caucus is willing to do in terms of the items that have already been discussed, and then we'll have to talk about these other two items and give our caucus members a chance to consider those and respond. But we've added more items to the agenda for what has to be resolved before we get to call a special session. And these are two very controversial items, and they know that. So it's like, what's their motive? And why, after we've been having discussions now for 3 weeks at the leadership level, is this the first time these items have been presented to us formally?
Governor, do you have a target for the next meeting, or?
I asked the Speaker to call the next meeting.
If this does not happen by 4th of July, does it
I don't have a deadline. I'm not setting a deadline. But at some point we'll have to see whether we're making any progress. Or if we're getting farther and farther apart, which is what the result is today, we don't need to get still farther apart.
Was there any negotiation on the bonding issues that
you're seeking?
Well, we had provided information today that the additional proposals that I made could be financed through appropriation bonds, which is not counted against the geo-bonding limit, which is what the House Republican caucus has said is their absolute ceiling of under $1 billion. So it would accomplish their objective and allow these projects to go forward. Now, if they think that there's a project in that group that shouldn't be funded because it lacks sufficient merit, no one's told me that. It's all been about the number, keeping the geo-bonding under $1 billion. So we've accomplished that and offered this alternative, which would satisfy their priority, fund some really important projects for higher education, and I'll wait for a response. But we're not getting anywhere with additional controversial items being added to the agenda.
Governor, I imagine the Republicans, when they take the podium here, are going to argue that offering new proposals like they did today isn't any different than what you did a couple weeks ago after the session ended, when you said that asked for new spending and bonding on the University of Minnesota and other areas. What's your response to that?
The definitive words are a couple weeks ago. When was my letter written? 3 weeks ago, I wrote a letter. We've been talking about that letter and other related matters for the last, I think the first meeting we had among the leaders was 2 weeks ago. This is our third meeting. We can stand corrected on the dates, but we're trying to narrow things down. We're trying to find a resolution to the issues that they have with my proposal. And now, 2 or 3 weeks later, they're adding their own additional items. That's certainly their prerogative, but it's not leading us toward a resolution. It's pushing us farther apart.
In the preemption, is it just wage or is it wage and benefits?
I didn't. They handed out a bill. I didn't. It says it had been introduced in the session. I haven't had a chance to read it. I don't know what it covers and what it doesn't cover.
But are you open to any kind of preemption?
I've said I can consider it, but it's got to be in combination with family leave or other matters. So it's a balanced proposal. It can't just be one way that says businesses don't have to do what I think most citizens think they should do, which is provide family leave, which is provide sick leave. I mean, Minneapolis had to require sick leave for the employers that are not now providing that. So, to preempt that is something the business community wants, but it's a matter of taking things off the table for workers, rather than a combination of consistency, for which there's a legitimate argument, but also in a more balanced and humane fashion.
Governor, are you saying that obviously you have objections to these particular issues, but that in general you're not open to resolving this deadlock by, instead of paring down what you want, by giving the Republicans something they want in return?
That's what evidently that's what they'll say that they want. I don't rule anything out. In 5 minutes before I left, they brought these two subjects up and handed out the bills. I haven't had a chance to look at them. I haven't had a chance to discuss them with anybody. I'm not commenting on the relative merits or not of those two pieces of legislation. I'm commenting on the fact that when you keep adding things, as we're trying to narrow things down, it's counterproductive. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Obviously disappointed that the governor has not moved a single centimeter from where he was a few weeks ago. What we talked about upstairs is the governor getting everything he wants, not wanting to give anything on anything else, and just paying for it in a different way. So instead of general obligation bonds, now it would be appropriation bonds. But they're still asking for every single one of the governor's list of demands. Doesn't seem to be any willingness to compromise on any of those things. And obviously I do agree with the governor. I think that's a setback. It's unfortunate that it took until today for the governor to see his list of demands as a setback. That's how we felt when he issued them 3 weeks ago. So we're obviously concerned that we're not making progress and the governor's not moving off of his list of demands, and I think that probably is going to make it difficult for us to get to agreement for a special session.
I just would reiterate that the bills that we had in the last day of session were compromise bills. Go back again, look at the tape, look at Senator Stumpf talking about the bonding transportation bill. He called it a true compromise between Republicans and Democrats. The speakers pointed out half of that bill had, more than half had governor priorities in it. And now we're at a point where apparently all those compromises are off the table, and we've got another $243 million of additional spending that we are being asked to do without any backing away from that number, and an additional, I don't know, a couple $100 million in bonding in total. I'm not sure what and all of this is sort of in complete denial of all the compromise work that had gone on this entire last session. This is what I find so remarkable. I think it is a setback. Why we should, after a whole session, and actually going back to the session before talking about some of these issues, to now have a bill get killed at the last minute with a request for a light rail project that no one had ever seen a hearing on, and now that becomes a must-have, and to say that we have to start over and renegotiate everything, I think it is a setback. I think it's a setback. I think the governor is taking us back. I think the speaker and in good faith negotiated agreements with the Senate majority Democrats. Those were passed by a very large margin. 89% of the legislature voted for the tax bill the governor vetoed. These were all compromises negotiated in good faith, and now we're back here where we have to renegotiate everything all over again. I think that's unfortunate that that's where we are.
Mr. Speaker, the governor said that because you brought these other proposals, the school tax credit and the other proposal in, that this just forces things further apart by bringing additional controversial items into the mix.
Well, first I'll say this isn't the first time we've talked about them. We talked about them during session. I was asking for them during session. We talked about them last week when we were here. I actually brought the language today to say, hey, just as a reminder, you are asking to bring a whole bunch of things to the table for negotiations, so I'm bringing a couple of things to the table for negotiations. He unfortunately thinks it's unreasonable for us to expect to bring anything to the table for negotiations, and that we should simply live with his entire list of demands. Sorry, I don't think there's a Minnesotan in the entire state that thinks that's reasonable. And if the governor wants compromise, he's going to have to be the leader and start showing some compromise, because he has shown zero compromise to this point. We had, as the senator said, great compromise bills put together at the end of session. We actually are north of 50% on our bonding limits if you take into account what the governor had in his general obligation bonding portion of his bill, and where we were at when we started. The governor expects me to negotiate to halfway and then to have to negotiate to halfway again. Sorry, that's not the way negotiations work. So I think that the bills that we put, I think the bills that we put, I think the bills that we passed out of the House on the last night of session were incredible compromise bills that have broad bipartisan support and broad public support. And it took a lot of work to get to that level of compromise. The governor apparently doesn't appreciate that, and he wants us to start from square one with negotiations without appreciating the work that we did during session. That's unfortunate. Frankly, I think that folks in southern Minnesota are going to want $85 million for Highway 14. I think that folks in western Minnesota are going to want $60 million for Highway 23. I think that folks going out of the West Metro are going to want $15 million for Highway 12, the most dangerous stretch of freeway in the state of Minnesota. And I'll remind you that part of the governor's demands are that we remove those projects from our bill. I think the governor is incredibly out of touch with where Minnesotans are at. And coming in today and saying, well, my new offer is everything that I want, but we'll just pay for it in a different way, isn't any compromise at all. And unfortunately, if the governor thinks that it's reasonable to expect that he can bring things to the table in negotiations and we cannot, also unreasonable. I'll also remind you that on the preemption issue, both of the legislative leaders on the Democrat side mentioned at the chamber dinner that they support this issue. The governor has made statements in the past that he will sign the bill if it gets to him. This is not a controversial issue. And the governor can try to make it a controversial issue if he wants to, but I don't know if I need to ask the chamber if I can pull the video from the from the chamber dinner when Bach and Thiessen both said, yes, we support preemption. And the governor actually has said to numerous business groups that he would sign the bill if it got to him. This is not controversial. Making sure that poor and minority students have an opportunity to go to private school, if that's a better situation for their family, which is proven to help close the achievement gap, is not a controversial issue. At least not with Minnesotans. Maybe it is with the teachers union, but it's not with Minnesotans. And you know what? I'm here to stand up for Minnesotans, not for a special interest group. So if the governor thinks these bills are controversial, then Minnesotans need to know why, We're not going to be spending $700 million on roads and bridges and all of the other infrastructure projects, by the way, which were some of the governor's #1 priorities as we worked through this process, okay? Like clean water and rail grade crossings. We're not going to be spending that money because the governor thinks that things that he has spoken in favor of and other Democrats say they support is controversial. This whole thing, I'm beginning to believe that Democrats don't want a special session, that they think they'd like to play the blame game for the election. And if that's the game that we're playing, I don't want any part of it. Because what we put on the table at the end of session and passed them both out of the House were a tax bill that really represents the values of Minnesotans, and a bonding bill that represents where Minnesotans, I think, want their investments made. And we think those are incredible compromise bills, and I think if you look at the number of votes that each of those bills achieved at the end of session, I think that's where Minnesotans are at. And if the Democrats would rather play politics than actually pass those two bills, which we know are good for Minnesota, then I think they deserve what they're going to have coming in the election.
When you reach your walkaway point, or have you already?
No, I mean, he wants me to call the next meeting. I don't know. I could call it for tomorrow. I don't know what that means. Frankly, I think we probably have too many people in the room upstairs too. There's a lot of puffing out the chests up there, and not a lot of rolling up the sleeves. And unfortunately, if we're going to get there, I'm going to, and by the way, it's the two of us and 20 of them. We're happy to roll up our sleeves. Maybe when I come to the next meeting, I'll actually have my sleeves rolled up to show that I'm ready to work. But we're going to need the 20 Democrats in the room to roll up their sleeves if we're actually going to get our work done. And right now, it's not Republicans that are stopping this progress. It's Democrats. And that's very clear.
How likely at this point do you view a special session?
I actually, and this is going to sound really foolish after what I just said, I'm very optimistic we're going to have a special session because I don't think there's a chance in HE double hockey sticks that the governor is going to walk away from $700 million for roads and bridges, for how many hundreds of million dollars for clean water, for rail grade crossings, tax relief for veterans, for college students, for parents with kids in daycare, for parents saving for college students paying off student loan debt. I don't think there's a chance that the governor is going to say, I think I'd rather play politics this election than actually do what's right for Minnesota. So I think it will get done, but I'm going to need to give the governor a little more time to roll up his sleeves.
So special session won't happen before July, is that safe to say now? Is the clock kind of ticked out on that?
It absolutely can. We're ready. And I think the compromise that we showed on the last day of session shows that we, Republicans in the legislature, are ready to compromise, and we're ready to do what we know Minnesotans want. It could happen this week. I don't think that's likely until, watch the governor. If you see him walking around with his sleeves rolled up, I think we're getting close. That might be your visual cue.
So you say the governor has moved from his list of demands just post-session. Have you all moved since what you passed and what you tried to pass on the last night?
Well, the governor doesn't appreciate that those bills at the end of session were compromised. Though we moved incredibly. Where the governor is basically almost where he started. We've moved an incredible amount, and we're over halfway on bonding. Remember how the governor said, if they'll meet us halfway, we'll pass a bonding bill? We're over halfway. We're literally over halfway to where the governor was. And so either the governor doesn't mean it, and he'd rather play politics, or he's not compromising like he says he is. And I think, maybe both are true. I'm not sure. You'll have to ask him.
The thing that I still do not understand, this is a divided legislature. You've got Democrats in majority in the Senate, Republicans in the House. The bills that were agreed on was a compromise package. I don't understand how the governor looks at this as, well, this is Republican stuff and we need to compromise and get more for the governor's position. The entire supplemental spending bill, for example, that was passed bipartisanly in the legislature. As I recall, the House Republicans had a spending proposal, if you will, a budget proposal that was neutral. It reprioritized some things but didn't add additional spending. So that entire spending package, as the governor signed, was a part of a compromise that included taxes, spending, bonding, transportation, all those things, the four big things that had to get done. So how this cannot be viewed as a compromise, that's our frustration in our caucus, is that we're now being asked to consider the compromises that were worked through as to somehow be the Republican position that the governor needs to counter with more of his own demands. It's unreasonable. I think the governor needs to rethink this. I think the speaker's exactly right. Look what's in those bills. Look at the things that are included in those compromises. It's good for the state of Minnesota. They represent bipartisan agreement that took a long time to reach. Why those bills cannot be taken up, repassed again, is a mystery to me.
I'll also say, on Southwest Light Rail, again, I mean, this may be the largest stumbling block to even get to special session. The governor and Democrats in the room still saying that they have to have Southwest Light Rail as part of a special session or somehow get to Southwest Light Rail. I'll remind folks that Southwest Light Rail has never had a hearing in the legislature. It has not been properly vetted. There are 2 outstanding lawsuits. This is a highly controversial project, and when we go out on the road and talk about where we're at, I think Minnesotans see that $700 million of road and bridge money is currently being held hostage for Southwest Light Rail. And I think that's what frustrates Minnesotans about the political process, and I don't blame them. It's probably not a coincidence that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are doing well this presidential election cycle. They're the outsiders, right? Because people don't like business as usual. They don't like when things are snuck into a bill via amendment on the very last night of session. By the way, that amendment in the Senate was never introduced as a bill, was never heard in committee, and really has never been talked about publicly. But we add it with 15 minutes to go in session, claim that everybody had agreed to it. I don't know if I need to lay breadcrumbs here. Follow the story, okay? People are saying that was agreed to on the last night of session. It either was or it wasn't. Somebody contact my office and I'll be happy to do interviews with you about that. It very obviously had not been agreed to, but somebody's not being honest about that, okay? You'll find the story, it's there.
You had that conversation in a private room.
Well, I had a conversation on the floor with Senator Bach 40 minutes before midnight, and he was asking me for additional votes beyond the 2 that is required to pass a bonding bill. They need 2 of our votes under normal circumstances to get the supermajority, and he told me that there were 7 members of his caucus that had to have light rail in the bonding bill in order for it to pass, and since it wasn't going to be in there, he wanted to know if we had 9 more votes we could give him. I said, well, we're going to go to caucus right now. I'll come back and tell you, and I did. And when we got back, almost immediately we started up again, and Senator Stump introduced the bill, and he talked about it as a compromise bill, and then we had the amendment. So at the conversation I had with Senator Bach on the floor, at least in his mind, there was no provision for light rail in that bonding bill. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been asking me for more votes. That's all I know.
Yeah, I had a similar conversation with Senator Bach at 11 o'clock when I was on the Senate floor. There's photos of me on Twitter talking to him. He showed me a picture on his phone of his son catching a fish that day. There's pictures of him showing me that picture on his phone. If there's one thing that has to be good in St. Paul, it's your word, okay? And he knew that wasn't going to be in the bill. We talked about it. That's why we were twisting arms to get extra votes to make sure that bill was going to pass. Everybody knew that was the case. I lose more than 7 votes in the House if that's in. I probably lose 60 votes in my caucus, and then we can't pass a bill. So, and the folks who are pushing for Southwest Light Rail, they need to sell the project, not me. These people need to ask for public hearings and need to promote this project and explain to the public and show its value. This is a project that frankly should not move forward. And I got to tell you, since I have taken a little stronger stand saying that this project needs to live or die on its merits, I have never had more emails of support from people who probably are not Republicans saying, please don't give in. Please do not let this project move forward. It doesn't make sense. I ran into a woman in downtown Minneapolis who rides North Star in every day to work. She commutes every day. And I asked her how she liked it. And she said, well, I use it because I don't like to drive into the cities. But she said, I liked the bus a lot better. And the bus did it in about the same amount of time. It was more comfortable. It was more convenient. She liked the bus better. And the bus was actually way cheaper. And if need changes, you can actually move the bus to a different corridor. So is rail the most efficient and effective way to use our dollars? The answer is a resounding no. We have other options that can work better and far more effectively and far more efficiently than rail. So my hope is let's do what we agree on. If we actually agree on money for roads and bridges, let's pass the bonding bill the way it passed out on the last night of session, and let's let Southwest Light Rail live or die on its own merits in the next legislative session. Maybe once the lawsuits have resolved themselves.
And again, on that 90 votes on the House floor for the bill, the bonding transportation bill, and they took amendments that night. That's what we were waiting for in the Senate, for the bill to come over. There were no amendments offered by anybody in the House for this light rail project. And let's remember why we would not be here today except for the fact that the Senate Democrat majority put that amendment on the bill and they didn't have time to get it back to the House to even be considered. That's why that bill failed. That's why we're here. A bill that was a compromise, described that way by Senator Leroy Stumpf, passed the House with 90 votes, I think, came over to the Senate, and the Senate majority killed that bill. Had they passed the bill that had been agreed upon, we would not be here today. We would not be talking about special session. The governor would not have found a reason to veto the tax bill. We would be done. But this is why. Let's make sure we understand why we are here today.
Thank you.